Well, welcome to this coffee break in unusual circumstances where we find ourselves in the middle of a coronavirus outbreak, and probably who could have imagined we would find ourselves facing this kind of situation as we find ourselves in now at the time of recording. And because many of us are not able to meet, or there's restrictions in many countries, and proximity and ability to meet and talk and discuss is limited, it seemed a good idea just to put a few thoughts together in a coffee break and circulate that, just to try and be of some help and reflection together to both within the Relational Mission family churches and all our different partner friends and brothers and sisters in different parts of the world, different networks and churches and people who we know and love. So I wanted to just put that together. Just a few things really just to think about as I've been thinking about this. First thing just to say is I think we need to start with feeling a sense of compassion, and indeed sadness isn't inappropriate for us as Christians. I know we're people of hope, but actually to begin by feeling a deep sense of compassion and sadness for those who are going to be affected in particular strong ways through this virus, through serious illness, or even hearing the Prime Minister of the UK, as many world leaders have said, many of us are going to lose family members ahead of their time. That's quite a thing to hear, the Prime Minister saying. And to him, different health workers saying we might end up having to bury some of our colleagues. These are big things to hear, and they're not sensationalized. They're things that people who are saying, who are in positions of power and authority with knowledge, are saying with measured reflection. So it's good for us to start by feeling a sadness in our hearts that so much suffering and difficulty could come to many, many thousands of people across the different nations that are affected. And Jesus began with compassion, didn't he? When he looked out at the crowds, he had compassion on them before he did anything. And Nehemiah, when he was facing the rebuilding of the walls in Jerusalem, he felt something before he did something. And I think it's important that we allow ourselves to feel moved. We allow tears to come. We allow our prayers to be salted with tears. These are biblical things. It's important that we feel the sufferings of those around us as Christ feels the sufferings of those who suffer. So I think that's important to say. We start with compassion. We start with a sense of genuine sadness and feeling for those who are suffering. But next we need to move to kindness, and I think kindness can be expressed in lots of different ways. Kindness is a very godly thing. We need to firstly obey the authorities and the different things they're putting in place and advice, and not be experts in our own mind, just to support and encourage and comply with government and medical advice and medical wisdom. Also to be aware that, people are wonderful. I know we live in a fallen world and sin has ruined every single person. We need a saviour, but there's still the image of God, however distorted it's been by sin, and people do wonderful things at times of great upheaval in society, and we must applaud the common good where we see it, where genuinely good and wonderful and brave things are being done, and play our part as God's people to look for the common good, to see where we can magnify the human spirit and the goodness that we see all around us. Let's make a difference to the world that we're in and be a blessing. It says, people will see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven, that we have a part to play in that. And so kindness of words, of thoughts, of deeds, of perspective, of trying not to be people who talk down but who talk up, and that's good. Next, I think we need to have biblical maturity. At times like these, there are all sorts of strange doctrines and thoughts going on. Firstly, this is not the end of the world, and Revelation. Even I saw a tweet from John Hosier talking about Revelation 6:8, where it talks about, I looked and behold a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him, and they were given authority over the fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. And the point he was making is that this is not that, but that is an example of this. And Revelation, I think, is best read as a cyclical book. It describes what has been. Ecclesiastes says what has been will be again. There's nothing new under the sun. And our world continues to go in these spirals of evil and decline, but but the gospel and the church will prevail, and the dark will get darker, but the light will get lighter. And Revelation is very much a book of cycles. It just describes human history. Even finding things recently, Luther, Spurgeon, Robert Murray McCheyne, people even in recent last 300-400 years who've faced similar sort of outbreaks of deadly disease. It's not uncommon, and before a medical advance it was far more common. So we're not facing the end of the world, but it is a sign of the brokenness of the world, and Revelation points to that kind of ongoing cycle of decline. And so we have to be mature about it and recognise that we are in creation is groaning and longing for liberation from decay, and these kinds of things just are examples of that. Next, we need to have hope, but not bravado. The phrase "fear not" is seen very often in the Bible because for us as human beings, death is our greatest enemy. It is not natural to die. We fear death. It's normal to fear death. That's why Jesus came to deliver us from death, because death is an enemy to us and it provokes fear. But Jesus said, "Fear not, for I've overcome the world." So wrestling with issues of fear, particularly if you're in a vulnerable health category or you've got concern about loved ones, that's normal to feel those kinds of fear and anxiety, but we have to allow Jesus' strength to give us hope in the midst of that, because he says, "Fear not, I've overcome the world." So there is something that we have as Christians, but we mustn't kind of come over very, very bravado, sort of like, "I'm not afraid to die." I kind of feel that doesn't really help anybody. We sound more like Gaston out of Beauty and the Beast rather than a kind of a biblical measured response. And we have to understand that within such a situation as this, there is hope. Jesus will always have the last word. You know, what the enemy intended for harm, God has meant for good. That's what Joseph reflected to his brothers. Biblical principle: when the enemy comes in one way, he'll flee from you by 7. God will always have the last word. All things work together for the good of those that love God. There is a purpose that God will work out of this, and we have to trust in the goodness of God, that his purpose will prevail. It really will. Next, it is important that we reflect on our own frailty at such a time and be humble as people. In Job it says, if it were his intention and he withdrew his spirit, all of mankind would perish. There's something about realising every breath we have is not just natural, it's a gracious providence of God to give every human being life and breath. And so we must be humble and realise that our world, our lives are held in God's hands. And even as people rage against God and don't want anything to do with him, he's still kindness and tenderness giving them life that they might turn to him. So humility is important. And I think at times like these, perhaps some people will be a little bit more open to reflect on eternal matters. So I think we must be willing and ready to pray for people, to offer to pray for people who are troubled or concerned. Just say, "Would you like me to pray for you?" I think that's a beautiful thing to do. If people want to know a little bit more about the gospel, about what it is to be a Christian, then I would really recommend the 3 circles. You can find it on YouTube if you just put in the 3 circles with number 3 from the No Place Left team. I think there's a beautiful little 3-minute way of just explaining the gospel. You can write it on a napkin or a piece of paper, and or even just talk it through, and it just helps you have something to follow in your mind when you're perhaps trying to explain in a short period of time to someone what it is to be a Christian. I find that a really helpful little tool, and perhaps many of us are going to get lots of opportunities in the coming months to share the gospel with people. Next, I would suggest we need to be people of prayer. Now, our Enough initiative is gaining momentum, and I believe that maybe through this we might be able to even multiply prayer in some way. I'm thinking through that at the moment, but I think we need to maximise asking. Local churches need to maximise asking God to help us and be with us. most people don't find it difficult to pray during times of difficulty, and we will be facing times of difficulty. So I think prayer should become a lot more natural and easy for people, and we need to be praying medically, economically, socially, politically. We need to be praying for God to really help us in our different aspects of life of the nations we're in. And then lastly, for church leaders, I think we need to be encouraging each other across our families of churches. These are complex times full of pressing decisions about events and money and pastoral concerns, and trying to plan without any sort of map or compass to know even what the next weeks and months, even the rest of this year or beyond, is going to look like. It's very difficult, and I think we need to be people, men and women, who are leading by the Holy Spirit rather than by the flip chart in this next season. And we need to be watching for what God's doing, expecting him to, even though there's massive change of plans, recognize that God will have the last word. I was so blessed by a reflection, one of our wonderful pioneers out in Poland, Kev Riley, when he recently had to cancel an event that had taken a lot of planning. He wrote this. He said, "Jacob, who took his family on a journey only to be jumped by a stranger in the middle of the night, saw beyond what was happening and fought on, unwilling to give way." He's talking about Jacob wrestling with God. "He did so in order to receive a blessing," Genesis 32, 22 to 31. "He had a destination in mind, but during his journey he became aware of the prospect of an even greater blessing, and he fought for it." And I do think that we mustn't see all our ruined plans and diaries scattered, blowing in the wind as a failure. Rather, there is an opportunity that God will give for greater blessing, and I believe God will give us wisdom as leaders to find his will, to find his purpose, to find his wisdom in planning coming through this. So there's just a few thoughts. I trust that will be of encouragement and help. Let's keep praying for each other, encouraging each other, and let's trust that God will bring tremendous glory to his name out of this very, very sad situation, but something that God will turn for his glory and for the salvation, I believe, of many thousands of people. Bless you.